He understood the mountain before he ever learned to read it. The ridgeline spoke to him in the low, slow language of rock and weather, where the wind favored one shoulder of the range, where the pines kept their needles longer, where the snow lay heavy and long and where it would slip away come March. On a night when the world felt thinner than a sheet of tin and the wind clawed at the shutters like a living thing, his cabin held an argument with the storm and by morning had clearly won. Steam rose from the kettle on the iron stove and curled under the low rafters. The wood floor was dry underfoot. The air tasted of cedar and coffee, not of damp and mold. Outside, birches bowed under white roofs. Inside, a single lamp hummed, and a man with weathered hands sat wrapped in an old wool blanket, as if in the center of a calm eye. That contrast, between the harsh, indifferent elements and the soft, stubborn warmth inside, formed the first of many small mysteries that kept neighbors and travelers talking. Stories passed from porch to porch, gathering detail and romance, until the man became less a neighbor than a symbol, the mountaineer who had learned to disagree with rain. People speculated in low voices about insulation and luck, about hidden modernities and clever contraptions. Some guessed at foam and tar, others at secret vents and batteries, but the truth felt simpler and stranger at once. The secret was not an appliance you could buy, it was a practice, an attention, a conversation with the house as if it were a living, listening thing. You sensed the man before you met him, the stoop of his shoulders carrying 100 winters, the slow, efficient movement of a lifetime exercised in small, necessary motions. He had the economy of expression of someone whose language had been pared down to what mattered. He spoke rarely, and when he did, his words arrived like tools, dry, useful, honest. There was no pretense in his pride. He had learned to read timber, to listen to the way wood creaked in different weathers, to understand the trustworthiness of different kinds of knots. His hands bore the history of every nailed board and repaired roof. He knew which trees would split and which would stand for decades. He had come to trust the mountain's petty cruelties as a teacher rather than an enemy. The cabin itself seemed to have grown rather than been built. Its lines were irregular, its beams mismatched as if the house had been assembled from the leftovers of other projects and the cast-offs of a life. The porch sagged a little on the right. A patch of darker wood near the stove showed where a repairer's hand had once followed a leak with stubborn attention. Yet the structure possessed an interior intelligence. Doors closed with a certain stubbornness that kept drafts at bay. The chimney exhaled smoke in a pattern the man had taught it to keep, and most curiously, the walls never held the damp smell that hung in so many other homes in the hollow after a week of thaw and rain. It was as if the cabin itself made a small private law. Moisture might come, it would not stay. The opening scene is not simply a literal one. It is an invitation to witness a way of being attentive that most of us seldom practice. The slow art of living with limits and nevertheless making a kind of abundance. In the age of climate-controlled comfort, the idea that a single trick, handed down in this case through ragged hands and quiet observation, could keep a house warm and dry reads like a fable. But it is not a parable contrived in a classroom. It is the accumulation of small experiments, losses and recoveries. This man had failed often enough to know the precise difference between what looked like a fix and what actually worked. As dusk fell on the ridgeline, the wind came with a particular sound, a hollow, traveling chill that tells old hands where to brace. The man moved through his cabin on habit and intuition. He checked the stove, he checked the threshold, he felt the seams of his windows. These were not acts of fear so much as ritual. They were the rites by which he kept disorder at a tolerable distance. The whole evening, without fanfare, he mended a seam here, repositioned a plank there, tightened a cord. It was an architecture of attention. Every small repair was a sentence in an ongoing conversation between home and weather. And then there was the thing that made the neighbors lean in and the visitor take notes. It was not the stove, nor the wheel of precise carpentry alone, nor a single magical material. It was the way he arranged the house to breathe on its own terms, to admit winter without surrendering to it. It was, in short, a secret that had more to do with listening than building. The mountain had taught him how to make shelter that was not merely resistant to the world but in dialogue with it, a shelter that did not seek to dominate but to accommodate. The tale opens on such a note because the audiences, I imagine, people who have known their own winters, who value thrift and intuition and the language of craft, respond to the proof of life in things. They understand the story's central question before it is fully spoken. How does one keep warmth in without trapping damp? How does one respect the mountain without being consumed by it? And there is, behind those questions, the deeper human curiosity about how small particular wisdoms survive where ignorance might be expected to rule. This is not simply a lesson in carpentry. It is a meditation on resourcefulness and the patient, often invisible labor that keeps families fed and houses standing year after year. You should feel the cold pressing in from outside and the stubborn human calm at the cabin's center. You should wonder with a tightening in your chest what simple action could produce such a reliable result. The answer will not be quickened by gadgets or big configurations. It will demand attention to form, to material, to the history that sits inside planks and beams. Above all, the beginning sets a mood, reverence for the small and the true, for those who keep secrets quietly because the work itself is the reward. The story of the mountaineer's life began long before that winter, which turned him into a whisper on the wind. His name had been Eli McCrae, though few still remembered it. Most simply called him the man up the ridge. He was born when the last steam train still shook the valleys of the southern Appalachians, when a boy could walk 10 miles of forest without seeing another soul and return home with his pockets full of chestnuts. His childhood home had no running water, no electricity, but a hearth that never went cold. His father was a taciturn man who believed that a wall well built was a prayer, and that prayers did not need to be heard, only felt through the grain of wood and the weight of a nail driven straight. His mother sang hymns while she patched shirts, her voice thin as a line of smoke rising through the rafters. That was how Eli learned that warmth was not a given. It was earned, tended, coaxed into staying. When he was 12, he helped his father repair a cabin for a widow whose roof had collapsed under the snow. The two men didn't speak much. His father simply showed him where to place the boards, how to angle the plane to follow the wood's will rather than fight it. Wood tells you when it's had enough, the old man said. You just got to listen. Eli never forgot that. He came to understand that carpentry wasn't about hammering things into obedience, but about making peace with imperfection. Each plank had its own memory, and if you could read it right, you could build something that breathed with you through the seasons. Those early winters shaped him into a man who believed that the mountain never truly tried to kill anyone. It merely tested whether they were paying attention. The Great Depression hollowed out the valleys, sent families to cities, left homesteads empty. But Eli stayed. He trapped rabbits and foxes, raised a few goats, cut firewood for anyone who couldn't manage the saw anymore. He grew lean, not poor. Every coin he earned went into a small jar that he kept behind the stove, and when he had enough, he bought a plot of land high on the slope, where the pines leaned into each other like conspirators. There he built his cabin, not all at once, but piece by piece, scavenging timber from abandoned barns, shaping it by hand. The cabin was his answer to every question life had ever asked. How much warmth can a man make with his own 2 hands? How much silence can he endure before it becomes peace? By the time he finished, he was already an old man, but the cabin stood as if it had been there forever, older than memory. Its walls carried a quiet confidence, the same kind you see in people who have stopped asking for approval. It was a small thing, just 1 room and a loft, but it had a soul. Neighbors who visited said it felt alive, as though the air inside moved differently, and perhaps it did, because when the blizzards came, when roofs cracked under ice, Eli's cabin never groaned. When spring floods rose from the valleys, the floor stayed dry. There was no trickery, no modern invention, only a secret buried deep in the old man's understanding of wood, wind, and water. That understanding was tested one winter more brutal than any he had faced before. The year was 1978, when the cold came early and refused to leave. Frost hung on branches like crystal armor, and the creeks froze so hard that the trout were trapped midstream. Eli's nearest neighbor, a man named Rufus Hayes, came up one evening, his beard crusted with ice. "Roof's leaking again," Rufus said, stomping his boots. "Feels like the damp's crawling into my bones." Eli handed him a cup of coffee, silent for a long while before saying, "You build tight, Rufus. Too tight. Let a house breathe and she'll take care of you." Rufus frowned, not understanding. He had packed his walls with insulation, sealed every crack, nailed tar paper from floor to rafters. His cabin was airtight, and yet it sweated like a sick horse. Eli's cabin, by contrast, looked fragile. You could see daylight between some of the outer boards, but when you stepped inside, you felt something different. It wasn't just warm, it was balanced. The air felt dry, soft, alive. Rufus rubbed his hands by the stove and shook his head. "Don't make sense," he muttered. "Your place ought to be freezing." Eli smiled faintly. "Things that make sense in town don't always work up here," he said. "The mountain's got her own logic." He didn't explain further, and Rufus left puzzled, convinced the old man was simply lucky. But luck doesn't hold for decades. It doesn't keep timber from rotting or walls from sweating. There was something deeper at work, something Eli knew in his bones. That night, as the wind screamed through the pines and the temperature fell below zero, Eli sat by the stove and watched the flames reflect in the glass of the small window. He listened to the way the fire breathed. He could tell by the pitch of the crackle how well the smoke was drawing up the flue, how dry the wood was, how much air the cabin was letting in. It was a conversation, as real and necessary as any between two people. He reached up to the wall, running his fingers along the seam where two boards met, feeling for the faint pulse of air that told him everything was working as it should. The warmth in the room wasn't trapped, it was circulating. It moved through the cabin the way blood moves through a body. And he thought of his father again, saying, "Wood tells you when it's had enough." Outside, the storm raged for 3 days. Roofs caved in across the valley. Chickens froze in their coops. Pipes burst in houses that prided themselves on being modern and insulated. But Eli's cabin endured, as it always had. The snow piled on the roof, slid off, melted along the eaves. When the storm finally broke and the sun returned, the old man stepped outside into the blinding white and saw his breath rise in clouds. The cabin behind him steamed slightly, as if exhaling relief. That was when he realized the secret wasn't a secret at all. It was a relationship. A house like a man must learn to breathe to stay alive. When Rufus came back a week later, he found Eli chopping wood, the cabin shining in the pale sun. "Whatever you're doing," Rufus said, "teach me." Eli laughed, low and quiet. "Ain't something I can teach quick," he replied. "You've got to listen to what the wood wants, and most folks don't have the patience for that." Still, he took pity on his friend and agreed to show him the first step. They spent the day walking around the cabin, Eli explaining in fragments, the angle of boards, the way air should slip in at the base and out near the rafters, how moisture could be guided out instead of sealed in. Rufus took notes, though half of it sounded like poetry. To him, it made no practical sense, but he tried it anyway. That spring, when the rains came, and Rufus's cabin stayed dry for the first time in years, he returned with a look that was half gratitude, half disbelief. Eli only nodded. "Told you," he said. "The mountain doesn't want to hurt you. She just wants you to listen." And so the legend began to spread, about the mountaineer whose house never froze, who understood wood the way some people understand music. Years later, when Eli was gone and his cabin still stood, locals would swear you could hear the boards whisper when the wind rose, as if the house itself remembered the man who'd taught it how to breathe. The winters in those mountains had a way of erasing time. One day you were splitting logs under a cold blue sky. The next the world was reduced to white silence, every branch painted with frost. Seasons did not pass. They circled, repeating themselves like an old story told around a fire. And in that rhythm, Eli McCrae found his peace. He had never been a man of crowds. He trusted silence the way other men trusted sermons. When the storms would lift and the air cleared enough to see the next ridge, he would stand outside his cabin with his hands in his pockets, eyes narrowed against the light, and think about how the mountain had shaped him, how every nail, every board, every breath of smoke from his chimney had been a lesson in endurance. The secret that kept his cabin warm had come not from invention but from attention. Many years earlier, before he had even built this house, Eli had spent a winter repairing a collapsed barn near the Tennessee line. It was there that he noticed something most men missed. The barn, abandoned and half-rotted, had one wall that remained bone-dry no matter how much snow lay outside. It puzzled him until one night, while the wind rattled the loose boards, he crouched by the wall and felt a faint draft moving upward. The boards were old chestnut, spaced unevenly. Between them, air was slipping through, cold air in, warm air out, and yet the wall stayed dry. It dawned on him then that the wood was breathing. The barn wasn't losing warmth, it was exhaling moisture. Nature had its own kind of architecture, one that didn't fight the elements, but worked with them. That discovery stayed with him, buried like a seed waiting for the right soil. Years later, when he began building his cabin, that memory guided every decision. He did not seal the boards tight. He left narrow channels where air could move freely. He layered moss and dried clay between the outer walls, not as insulation but as a kind of filter, a living skin that absorbed and released dampness depending on the weather. Under the floorboards, he built a shallow trench filled with river stones to collect condensation and guide it away from the foundation. His roof was made of overlapping cedar shingles, cut thin enough to flex with the wind. Every piece was placed by hand, following the grain. He even adjusted the direction of the roof so the prevailing wind would sweep moisture off instead of pressing it in. These choices seemed small, but together they turned the cabin into something alive. A structure that breathed and sighed with the seasons, never trapping what could move, never holding what should pass. People who came to visit often laughed at the gaps in his walls, the uneven seams, the rough appearance of his work. "You'll freeze come January," they said. But January came, and they were the ones knocking on his door when their pipes burst or their roofs leaked. Inside Eli's cabin it was never too hot or too cold. The warmth felt steady, natural, like sunlight stored in wood. The floor was dry even when the valley turned to mud. He never bragged about it. He simply said, "A house is like a man. If it can't breathe, it dies." To him that was truth enough. What made the secret remarkable wasn't its complexity, but its humility. Eli had stumbled upon something forgotten in the rush of progress, the principle that every material, every space, every form of shelter must live in harmony with what surrounds it. Long before engineers spoke of ventilation systems and moisture control, he had solved the problem with patience and common sense. The old ways, he often said, had more science in them than people realized. His father used to test wood by the smell it gave off when cut, pine sweet, oak sharp, chestnut mellow like tobacco. That smell told you how the wood would behave, how it would hold or release heat, how long it would last. Eli followed that instinct in everything he built. It wasn't superstition, it was experience turned into wisdom. The following winter tested the full measure of that wisdom. Storms rolled in one after another, snarling through the hollows, cutting off roads, felling power lines. Modern houses down in the valley filled with moisture, their owners fought mold and frozen pipes. Yet Eli's cabin remained steady. Inside, his fire burned low and even, the walls humming with a soft, dry warmth. At night, he could hear the wind searching for a weakness, probing the seams, but it never found one. The cabin answered with the creak of wood expanding and contracting, a rhythm like breathing in sleep. Eli would sit by the stove with a mug of chicory coffee, watching embers glow, feeling as if he and the mountain were sharing a quiet understanding. The trick, he thought, wasn't to conquer the cold, but to invite it in just enough to learn its language. In early spring, when the thaw began, water poured down the slopes, swelling the streams until they sang against their banks. Most cabins smelled of damp earth and rot that time of year, but Eli's did not. The floor remained dry, the air clean. It was then that he realized the true gift of his design. His cabin wasn't just surviving winter, it was cleansing itself with each passing season. The air that flowed through carried out the weight of the cold months, making room for the green return of life outside. Standing on his porch one morning, he felt the first warm breeze of April brush his face and thought, not for the first time, that a home was only as alive as the man who tended it. That year, younger men from the valley began coming up the ridge to learn from him. They brought notebooks, measuring tapes, questions. Eli would show them the way he layered the moss, the way he set the roof beams to catch the wind rather than fight it. Some took the lessons to heart. Others left shaking their heads, unable to believe something so simple could work so well. "There's no blueprint for it," Eli told them. "You've got to listen to what the wood wants, same as listening to your own breath. If you get that right, the rest follows." By the end of that summer, his cabin had become something of a pilgrimage site for craftsmen, young and old alike. They came not just to learn how to build, but how to live differently, to slow down, to observe. Eli didn't call what he taught a philosophy, but that's what it became. His secret trick was no longer a mystery hidden in one man's cabin. It was a quiet revelation about the way humans could live in rhythm with the earth instead of against it. By the time the next winter came, word of Eli McRae's strange, self-warming cabin had spread across 3 counties. Some people spoke of it as legend, others as proof that old mountain wisdom could still outwit the modern world. Young carpenters hiked up the ridge to knock on his door, notebooks in their pockets, hoping to see for themselves what the stories left out. Eli would welcome them with a nod, motion toward the stove, and pour strong coffee into mismatched enamel cups. He didn't lecture. He would simply gesture at a wall or run his fingers along a beam and say, "You've got to let it move." That was the whole lesson, and most visitors left unsatisfied because it seemed too small to matter. But those who stayed long enough to hear the difference between silence and stillness, understood that what he meant had little to do with construction and everything to do with patience. That winter began without mercy. The first snow came before Thanksgiving and never fully melted. January brought freezing rain that coated every branch in glass. Down in the valleys, roofs collapsed, pipes burst, families moved into relatives' basements to escape the damp. Eli stayed put. He chopped wood slowly, deliberately, as if each swing of the axe were part of a conversation with the forest. He knew how much to take and how much to leave. His woodpile stood like a small fort beside the porch, protected by a slanted roof of bark and tin. Inside the cabin, the air remained gentle. When he opened the door to fetch more logs, the warmth didn't rush out in a gasp the way it did in other homes. It drifted, steady as a heartbeat. Sometimes at night, he would sit by the window and watch the snow fall under the light of the moon. The world outside looked silent, but he knew it was alive with movement. Ice expanding, trees cracking, foxes slipping through the drifts. He took comfort in that hidden life. "Everything's breathing," he murmured once, as if the mountain might hear him. Even in the dead of winter, the cabin creaked softly, as if answering back. One evening, near the end of February, there came a pounding at the door. It was Rufus Hayes again, his beard frosted, his hands trembling. "The whole ridge road's blocked," he said. "We've got families down there freezing. Some of them can't get a fire to stay lit. The chimneys are backing smoke into the rooms. You got any ideas, Eli?" The old man put on his coat and followed him without a word. They trudged down through the snow, the cold biting their lungs, until they reached the first cabin. Smoke indeed poured from the door, the fire inside starved of air. Eli studied the roofline, the sealed windows, the layers of plastic that the owner had nailed up to keep the heat in. He shook his head. "They've smothered the house," he said quietly. "Fire can't breathe, neither can they." Then he set to work, prying open a narrow vent near the eaves, loosening boards so air could slip through. Within an hour the smoke cleared, the fire caught, and the house began to warm. That night, Eli and Rufus went from home to home, teaching the same lesson. A house like a living thing must breathe. By dawn, the ridge was alive again, with thin streams of smoke rising straight and clean into the sky. People gathered outside, stamping their feet for warmth, watching in awe as the stubborn chill finally began to lift. Someone said, "Eli's magic," and the crowd murmured agreement. But he only smiled and said, "Ain't magic, it's just listening." He stayed until he was sure every hearth was burning true before walking back up the mountain to his own cabin. The sun was rising, gilding the snow with gold, and the world felt freshly washed. That spring, When the snow melted and the roads cleared, the neighbors decided to thank him. They brought food, firewood, even a new kettle. They wanted to honor the man who had kept them alive through the worst winter in memory. Eli accepted their kindness with a shy nod, uncomfortable with the attention. "Didn't do nothing special," he said. "You all would have figured it out soon enough." But they knew better. Without his quiet intervention, many might not have survived. From that day forward, he wasn't just the man up the ridge. He became a kind of folk hero, though he never saw himself that way. He was simply a man who knew how to listen to wood. Years slipped by. The mountain remained, though the world below changed. Roads paved, phone lines strung, new houses built of concrete and glass. Yet Eli's cabin still stood, warm and dry through every season. As he grew older, he spent more time on the porch, watching the play of light through the trees, the slow crawl of shadows across the valley. Sometimes travelers stopped by to see the famous cabin. They expected some kind of invention, a hidden furnace, a secret compound mixed into the clay, but found instead a small, unassuming home built from hand-hewn boards and faith in observation. They would look disappointed until Eli said, "It's not the house that keeps me warm. It's the time I've spent knowing it." Then perhaps they understood. When the last autumn of his life arrived, the mountain burned with color: red maples, gold birch, the dark green of spruce on the higher slopes. Eli felt the season like an old song, both joyful and sad. He spent his days oiling the hinges, mending the roof, stacking wood. He knew the body gives way like old timber sooner or later, and he wanted to leave things ready. That November night the wind came again, sharp and restless. Inside, the cabin glowed softly, the air dry and fragrant. Eli sat by the fire, notebook on his knees, writing down every lesson he could remember: how to layer the moss, how to set the roof beams, how to read the mountain's breath. "For whoever listens next," he wrote. When he finished, he placed the notebook on the table, stirred the coals, and listened to the house breathe around him, steady as a heart. In the morning, the fire was ash and the man was gone, resting in his chair as if asleep. Outside, the snow had come early, covering the ridge in white. Neighbors found him there, peaceful, the cabin warm as ever. They said the air felt different inside, lighter, as if it carried part of his spirit. They buried him on the slope overlooking the valley, within sight of the house he had taught to live. And long after his footprints disappeared, the cabin remained. A quiet monument to one man's understanding that everything built with care, everything given breath, endures. Years later, long after Eli McRae had become more legend than man, a young engineer named Thomas Calder came to the Appalachian foothills. He worked for a company that built sustainable homes, sleek and efficient, with solar panels and computer-controlled heating systems. But for all his education and modern tools, Thomas had grown weary of his designs. They looked perfect on paper, yet somehow they always felt lifeless. The air inside those homes was still, the warmth too mechanical. Then one evening, while scrolling through an old regional archive, he stumbled upon a photograph, grainy, sepia-toned, of a weathered cabin on a ridge. The caption read, "Eli McRae's house, still standing." Something about it stopped him. The angle of the roof, the texture of the logs, it wasn't fancy, yet it seemed to belong to the mountain in a way that no blueprint could capture. The next week, Thomas packed his truck and drove south, chasing the whisper of that old story. Locals directed him up a narrow gravel road barely visible between the trees. "You'll know it when you see it," one said, "the house that breathes." By the time Thomas reached the ridge, dusk had fallen. The cabin stood there, untouched by time. Moss covered the stones, and the windows glowed faintly in the sunset, though no light burned within. He pushed open the door and stepped inside. The air was cool but not damp. It had the faint scent of pine and smoke. The floorboards groaned softly, not in protest but as if greeting him. Dust motes swirled in the golden light, alive, weightless. He found the old table, the stove, the rocking chair. On the wall hung a photograph of a younger Eli, thin, sharp-eyed, with hands like carved wood. Then Thomas noticed the notebook. It lay exactly where Eli had left it, its leather cover cracked, pages yellowed but intact. He opened it gently, afraid it might crumble. Inside, in neat, deliberate handwriting, was a lifetime's worth of notes, drawings of joint angles, measurements for roof slopes, even sketches of trees with annotations like "Listen to the grain" and "Never fight the bend." But what caught Thomas most wasn't the technical detail. It was the philosophy threaded between the lines. "A wall must breathe," Eli had written. "A house too tight will choke its fire. Let the wind visit, but teach it how to leave." Another page said, "Don't trap warmth, guide it. Let the earth lend a hand." These weren't instructions for building, they were lessons in coexistence. Thomas spent the night in the cabin. He didn't light a fire, he didn't need to. The place held its own warmth, gentle and constant, as if the mountain itself exhaled through the cracks. Lying on the floor, he listened to the faint shifting of wood, the sigh of the wind outside, and for the first time in years, he felt truly at peace. At dawn, he hiked to the clearing where Eli's grave stood, marked by a simple stone. The valley below shimmered with morning mist. Thomas took a deep breath and whispered, "You knew something we forgot." He returned to his truck with the notebook pressed to his chest and an idea forming in his mind, an idea that could change everything. Back in his office, Thomas began to design homes differently. He scrapped the mechanical perfection and started borrowing from the old man's principles. He built models that breathed, using natural materials, open ventilation, layered insulation made from moss and bark fibers. He let wood expand and contract, created small gaps to let air and moisture pass. His colleagues thought he was eccentric at first, chasing folklore instead of efficiency. But when the first prototype stood completed, an unassuming cabin nestled in the hills, it surprised everyone. In the dead of winter, without electricity or fuel, the temperature inside remained steady. The walls stayed dry. The fire burned clean and bright. Scientists came to measure humidity levels, airflow, temperature gradients, and none could explain it fully. Thomas smiled and said only, "It's the mountain doing its part." He named the design the McCrae model. The story of Eli McCrae spread again, this time across newspapers and online journals. People who had never heard of the man began quoting his words, "Don't trap warmth, guide it." Builders from as far as Norway and Japan came to learn the Appalachian secret. What had begun as one man's quiet wisdom became a philosophy of sustainable living, one rooted not in control, but in harmony. Years later, Thomas returned to that ridge with his own son. The cabin still stood unchanged, though the forest around it had grown thicker. "This," he said softly, "is where we learned how to listen." His son ran his hand along the old wall and said, "It feels alive." Thomas nodded. "That's because it is." They sat on the porch as the wind stirred the trees, and the same gentle creak of wood rose like an echo of Eli's voice. Some say that on cold nights, if you walk past that ridge and listen closely, you can still hear the faint sound of fire crackling inside, though no one has lived there in decades. The cabin endures, warm, dry, and alive, as if the spirit of the mountain man who built it still keeps watch, ensuring the fire never dies. Because in the end, Eli McCrae's secret trick was never about wood or moss or clay. It was about understanding that warmth isn't only something you build, it's something you nurture. It's the conversation between man and nature, between breath and silence, between what shelters us and what we belong to. And as long as that cabin stands, somewhere high in the Appalachians, it will keep whispering the same truth to anyone willing to listen. Everything built with respect will last, and everything that breathes will stay warm.